was scrolling Twitter recently when I came across this tweet. I love how the media spent decades queer-coding villains in an attempt to scare kids away from being gay, but all they really managed was producing a generation of... well, ignore the last part, but in all seriousness, there's some merit to the notion of queer-coding villains as a means to quote-unquote scare kids away from being gay. This idea got me retroactively thinking about the films I was raised with and how nearly every villain I could possibly think of was subtly or not so subtly queer-coded. Of course, that's not a particularly great pattern to pick up on, and it really brings with it quite a few more often negative insinuations of not only what it looks like to be queer, but what it means to be queer. So let's get into why this happened, how this happened, and what the heck this means for the examples given, but also for the future of representation in film and media. Because while this trope began as a product of homophobia and censorship, it still prevails today across nearly every genre, despite the abandonment of the previous censorship guidelines. And while things have certainly improved as modernity has progressed and societal tolerance has broadened, things are still far from 100% solved, and these tropes continue to affect the public's perception of queer identity alongside queer individuals' perceptions of themselves. Well, actually, before we can get into all of that, we must first understand what the term queer coding actually means. For the sake of this video, I'm going to define queer coding as when a character or scene is written or acted as queer, but either cannot be or is not explicitly queer. That might be for censorship reasons, but as you can see, queer coding relies heavily on subtext to imply a character's identity without ever fully revealing it. But unlike subtext, queer coding is usually intentional in order to associate queerness with other traits. However, unlike queer baiting, this is not done as a means to draw in queer audiences, and is instead done more for the intention of stereotyping certain queer-associated traits. These are the characters that never explicitly divulge their identity, but they can't help but set off your gaydar anyways. These characters partake in queer tropes or stereotypes either in their physical appearance, this might be through makeup or costume, in their behavior, personality, dialogue, or their narrative arc. So this might be who they affiliate with or who they are obsessed with. Or, it might be all three, as is the case with many of the coming examples. Male characters who are queer-coded may behave more flamboyantly or more feminine, and when compounding this with their villainy, it insinuates that their lack of masculinity is inherent to their deviance and evilness. Similarly, female characters who are queer-coded may behave in a more standoffish, more masculine way, which when compounded with their villainy suggests that their lack of soft femininity is directly related to their immorality and evilness. As we'll see through the examples provided, this is often intentional in the filmmaking process to put forth certain ideas of what it means to be queer, what it looks like to be queer, and how that may be tied to other character traits, archetypes, and morals. So back to the tweet. As you might notice, this tweet insinuates that queer-coding villains has been a decades-long intentional process with the sole intention of quote-unquote scaring kids away from being gay. This thoughtfully provokes the question not only of why this happened, but how they managed to get away with it. Well, the answer is actually simpler than you might expect, because it can all be tied back to one dude. Well, in the early days of cinema, in the 1920s and the 1930s, the widespread public perception of queer people was that they were unnatural, sick, or disturbed, and therefore a danger and threat to others. It was also around this time, in March 1930, that the first attempt at film censorship in the US was introduced by Will H. Hays. The Motion Picture Production Code, also commonly referred to as the Hays Code due to the creator, was a collection of 36 rules and guidelines given to film producers to follow that banned certain risque topics from the big screen that were considered by religious groups to be unsavory or morally corrupt. The goal was that this would hopefully ensure that studios were putting forth pure and moral cinema. And in all honesty, this wasn't the absolute worst thing. Cinema was still in its infancy and therefore a process of trial and error. And when looking at some of the items in Will Hays' list, a few of them kind of make sense, like banning explicit images of violence, banning detailed crime, and banning sexual assault. But then again, there were topics that fell into a more subjective gray area because the code also stipulated that so-called quote-unquote immoral topics like sexual perversion, which not only referred to homosexuality, but also any behavior deviating from the perceived traditional concepts of romance, sex, and gender, could no longer be explicitly portrayed on screen unless it was in an obviously negative context that explicitly showed how this behavior was either sinful or dangerous. Therefore, enter the queer-coded villain. Now, this isn't particularly surprising, because historically, monsters in literature and media have been used as reflections for real fears in society, like reconciling differences in race, gender, and sexuality. So, demonizing queer people, something the early 20th century was already super anxious about, was unfortunately easy. Therefore, these villains usually challenge traditional gender roles and the heteronormative nuclear family in the same way queer people might have been perceived to threaten the traditional expectations of gender or sexuality. The Hays Code subsequently shifted storytelling in film, especially queer narratives. Positive depictions of divergence from heterosexuality or traditional heteronormative gender roles were no longer allowed, in favor of solidifying and affirming heteronormative narratives. As a result, any divergence from traditional heteronormative practices was automatically associated with immorality and evil, hence why so many villains and personifications of evil held queer traits, stereotypes, and qualities. But beyond this, these queer-coded villains tend to fall into a few subcategories that we'll look at shortly. So, luckily, the Hays Code was abandoned in 1968 because it was super dumb, which allowed the introduction of more sympathetic queer characters. However, that didn't mean that queer-coded villains and homophobia were immediately eradicated. In fact, storytelling practices that were normalized during the reign of the Hays Code are still prevalent today across all genres, and poorly written queer-coded villains still pop up from time to time. That being said, a lot has changed since 1930, and that's where things get complicated, because while I've just set up queer-coding villains to be a terrible practice, which it largely is, there are a few exceptions, and some of these characters are kinda awesome. So now that the history is mostly out of the way, let's look at a few examples of subsections of the queer-coded villain from the last few decades and explore what makes some of them offensive and what makes some of them weirdly badass. A sissy villain, while evil, still contains the capacity for sensitivity, because after all, the hero must be capable of conquering the villain and prevailing in the end. This character must still maintain gray morality and ambiguous gender presentation and sexuality, however, because the audience is still meant to view the sissy villain as other, and entirely separate from the hero. Great examples of this trope that you might be familiar with include him from the 1998 series The Powerpuff Girls and Team Rocket from the Pokemon franchise. Both him and Team Rocket are clumsy, less than genius, evil geniuses who somehow manage to be outsmarted by actual children every single episode, which emphasizes not only how incapable and weak they are, but also how powerful and cool the heroes are. And both of them share a refusal to perform masculinity or femininity in any kind of discernible way, further emphasizing their ambiguity and sensitivity, which makes them easier to beat. As mentioned earlier, popular social stigma against men presenting femininity and quote-unquote unmanliness encouraged a tendency in media to assign effeminate traits to villains, which brings me to my next example. The Maltese Falcon was released in 1941 and was therefore still very much under the censorship guidelines of the Hays Code. The film, popularly regarded as the first true film noir, is a quintessential detective story that follows the protagonist, private investigator Sam Spade, as he is hired by 3 mysterious clients, all of whom want him to track down a valuable falcon statuette. One of the 3 clients is a meticulous and calculating man named Joel Cairo, arguably the true quote-unquote bad guy of the film, and therefore an early example of the queer-coded sissy villain trope. The film is based on the novel of the same name from 1930, in which Cairo is explicitly portrayed as homosexual. However, due to the stipulations of the Hays Code, explicit homosexuality was barred from the screen, meaning that Cairo's characterization and sexuality in the film needed to be implied and ambiguous to make it past the censors. Even though his sexuality couldn't be explicitly depicted on film, we can understand that Cairo is queer-coded and a sissy villain based on some rather offensive stereotypes of gay men and queer visual subtext. This includes the way he is noticeably effeminate in his mannerisms, speaks with a lisp, takes pride in and fusses with his style and fashion, and is explicitly associated with the smell of flowers. And if you want to get real psychoanalytical with it, you could also turn to the use of his cane as a phallic object, especially in the scene in which he is interviewed by Sam Spade, and we see him doing some interesting gestures. But beyond this characterization, it's important to note that Sam Spade is meant to serve as the embodiment of ethics and morals, and therefore it's significant that he clashes with Cairo, an implied homosexual, in order to signal to the audience that Cairo is an immoral individual, due to his sexual diversion. Even just looking at this one screen cap, the contrast between Cairo and Spade's masculinity is extremely clear, and it's visually evident that Cairo is smaller and physically shrinking away from Spade, and therefore weaker as a result of his implied femininity and sexuality. But in a way, queer-coding Cairo the bad guy also works the other way around to prove Spade's masculinity, because Cairo's smaller, weaker stature and persona exacerbates the protagonist's masculinity and heroism.
You mean the one you couldn't get to count? This is the second time that you have laid hands on me. When you're slapped, you'll take it and like it.
However, the sissy villain is not limited to film noir, and the trope transcends genre, as evidenced by my next example. Labyrinth is a fantasy film that centers on the protagonist Sarah's quest to save her baby brother from Jareth, the Goblin King. Jareth, played by David Bowie, is another example of the sissy villain trope, but he's interesting because this film came out nearly 20 years after the Hays Code was abandoned, so it can't be simply explained away by censorship. Not only does he wear makeup, have a glam rock wig, and flamboyant costume full of tight pants, dramatic flowing silk, and heeled boots, But we see that time and time again, his gender-bending persona and sensitive anti-masculine quote-unquote queer qualities are both what makes him a confusingly effective manipulator, but also what allows the heroine, Sarah, to ultimately outsmart him. The fact that Sarah, a teenage girl, can outsmart Jareth further exacerbates his quote-unquote unmasculine qualities. The fact they pick somebody like Bowie for the role, known for playing with gender expression, further solidifies the character's inherent queerness. By using Bowie, Jareth becomes a chameleon, shifting between evil, dangerous goblin and charming, glamorous rock and roll superstar. It is this shift away from traditional gender roles that allows him to be successful as an antagonist, suggesting that his departure and deviance from masculinity are directly related to his evilness and villainy. While we can read Jareth in a heteronormative lens, considering the film documents his obsession with Sarah, a young girl, his physical appearance still rejects gender conformity and traditional masculinity, instead favoring flamboyancy and feminine charm, which inherently associates him with deviancy and otherness. As mentioned previously in the description of the Hays Code, under censorship, if a character was to be same-gender attracted or transgender, they would need to be either brutally killed or presented as morally corrupted, or hell, why not both? This brings us to our next category of queer-coded villains. This trope is, pretty bad. Coinciding with society's fears that queer people were physically different and therefore dangerous, this trope takes it a step further to postulate that homosexuality and diverging from traditional heteronormative gender roles was the gateway to insanity, and therefore made queer people capable of committing terrible crimes, and even serial murder. Yeah, I'm not even going to try to rationalize that one, but this brings us to a few more examples. While this film doesn't technically include cross-dressing, it does include the idea that homosexuality can lead to murder, so I'm counting it. Alfred Hitchcock's film from 1948, Rope, is based on a play from 1929 of the same name. The play is largely inspired by the real-life murder of a 14-year-old boy, Bobby Franks, in 1924 by two University of Chicago students, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, who were rumored to have been romantically involved with one another. The film tells a fictionalized version of Leopold and Loeb's crime, the story of two men, Brandon Shaw and Philip Morgan, who strangle a former classmate to death in their fancy apartment in an attempt to prove that they are both intelligent enough to commit the perfect crime. As with The Maltese Falcon, the source material for Rope, the play, includes an explicit homosexual relationship between the two murderers, Brandon Shaw and Philip Morgan. But because this film was produced in the era of the Hays Code, the characters had to be implicitly queer-coded to comply with the censors and demonstrate how homosexuality is still sinful and can be associated with murder and deceit. They're characterized to be snooty, concerned with arts and humanities, fashion, and a more delicate taste in what they wear and what they drink. But most importantly, they see themselves as superior to everybody else, simply because of their taste and intelligence, pushing a harmful idea that queer people are arrogant and egotistical to the extent they would murder anybody who's inferior, which is implied to be those who are not also queer. The man they murder in the film is truthfully the only character in a committed heterosexual relationship after all. Take a look at this clip from the film.
Then may I ask, who is to decide that a human being is inferior and is therefore a suitable victim for murder?
The few who are privileged to commit murder.
And just who might they be?
Oh, myself. Philip. Possibly Rupert.
I'm sorry, Kenneth, you're out.
Gentlemen, I'm serious.
So are we, Mr. Catley. The few are those men of such intellectual and cultural superiority that they're above the traditional moral concepts. Good and evil, right and wrong, were invented for the ordinary average man.
This language makes it clear that Brandon sees himself as other and better than even his own friends. In fact, John Dahl, the actor that plays Brandon in the film, is believed to have been gay, which might also contribute to the character's queer coding. Regardless, we come to understand that these characters are sexually ambiguous and notably different from other male characters, which inherently queer codes them as something other than the hetero norm. Notice in this clip how they keep looking at each other longingly in the eyes, and then sometimes their gaze flits down to their lips. And this is very intentional acting. Listen also carefully to the dialogue in this clip, which takes place directly after Jimmy Stewart's character puts together the pieces and realizes his friends have committed a murder.
There must have been something deep inside you from the very start that let you do this thing.
Note how Jimmy Stewart postulates here, there must have been something deep inside you to let you do this thing, equating the lust to kill with Brandon's sexuality as an inherent part of his identity. And take a look at this clip.
You thought when you choked the life out of him? Is that what you thought when you served food from his grave? Well, I don't know what you thought or what you are, but I know what you've done. You've murdered. You've strangled the life out of a fellow human being who could live and love as you never could, and never will again. What are you doing?
Notice how he says, I don't know what you are, and more specifically how he suggests the murder was committed as jealousy over a man who could live and love as you never could, insinuating this culmination of events and murder was committed by gay men as an act of jealousy of a young, smart, handsome, heterosexual man who was able to be open with his relationship in a way that Brandon and Philip could not be. You see how this perpetuates pretty nasty stereotypes, right? Based in reality or not, this film was certainly embellished in a way that suggests some pretty clear morals. Of course, Jimmy Stewart's statement is kind of vague and could be taken to mean a number of things. It's not, explicitly talking about homosexuality, but that's precisely what the Hays Code was achieving. Any critically thinking audience can postulate that these statements pose Brandon and Philip as inherently other than the rest of the men, which supplements the queer coding of Brandon and thereby his quote-unquote roommate, Philip. Despite the fact that the real-life killers this story was based on were romantically involved with each other, the film takes this a step further to suggest that it was precisely their homosexual relationship that inspired the crime, in an effort to prove that they were superior, and as an act of jealousy over those who were able to openly love. Hence, their queerness is essentially tied to the root of their villainy and the murder. Alfred Hitchcock's wildly famous film Psycho centers on a young woman named Marion who flees after embezzling $40,000 from her boss. She ends up at the Bates Motel where she meets and then is murdered by the owner, Norman Bates. The audience comes to understand that Norman has a troubled relationship with his mother. It turns out that he killed her and her lover, then dug up her body, and then continues to live with her in the house on the premises of the motel. But most importantly, he dresses up as his mother to commit his murders, as we learn at the end of the film when Marion's boyfriend and sister come looking for her, only to find Norman screaming, wearing a dress and a wig, and wielding a knife. We come to understand that this quote-unquote mother part of Norman functions almost as a separate personality, and he is clearly mentally unstable and quote-unquote psycho, insinuating that his cross-dressing is directly tied into his tendency to commit crime and his mental state. As in Rope, Norman Bates is portrayed by a gay actor, Anthony Perkins, which adds to the way in which the character might be queer-coded. It's also worth mentioning a little more about Anthony Perkins' career prior to Psycho, because up until this role, he was typecast as the wholesome, banal, romantic lead in movies, which curated a specific boy-next-door star persona. Not only this, but he was also a recording artist with similarly wholesome and romantic hits. Therefore, you can imagine how seeing this man take on the persona of a cold serial killer would have shocked audiences and changed their perception of him. The role of Norman Bates was a pivotal point in Perkins' career. There was no going back from this. It permanently altered his star persona brand. Reading Psycho through the cross-dressing killer trope, supplemented by this context, we can understand how audiences would subliminally come to understand that this deviation from the wholesome heterosexual norm was unnatural. Seeing a beloved romantic actor and singer transform into a devil via cross-dressing certainly has a pretty negative connotation. And again, the film is based on a book of the same name from 1959 that was based on real-life serial killer Ed Gein. But here's the thing, Ed Gein was never a cross-dresser, nor did he ever actually exhume his mother's body. In reality, Ed Gein, or otherwise known as the Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Ghoul, did have a twisted relationship with his mother. After she died, he began to almost worship her and began to create a woman suit so that he could transform into his mother and actually be inside of her skin. To do this, he killed a woman in 1954 and again in 1957, and had additionally exhumed corpses and stolen from 9 graves in local graveyards and used their bodies to make various objects around his house. I will not be going into detail on what he did with them, just know that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was also based off of his crimes. But again, he wasn't a crossdresser, nor a transgender by any means. He was just a very sick, disturbed, abhorrent, and violent individual. Regardless, the cross-dressing killer trope is rooted in transphobia, and insinuates that cross-dressers, transgendered individuals, and more subliminally drag queens are all capable of sinister secrets, as it is often revealed that these characters are transgender or cross-dressers at the same time we find out that they are also capable of brutal torture or murder. This insinuates a connection between the two identities, and suggests that cross-dressing is to be associated with the perverse, mentally ill, and the psychotic. Overall, while Psycho is a phenomenal film in many other ways, the notion that Norman Bates commits crimes because he also has a feminine, cross-dressing side to his personality is extremely offensive, and it's clear they extrapolated from Gein's crimes to push a moral agenda that dangerously blends cross-dressing with serious mental illness. But this trope does not end here. Here's a brief list of some other films that feature this trope, some poorly inspired by Ed Gein, some not. See if you can pick up on a pattern. Homicidal from 1961 features a transvestite killer. No Way to Treat a Lady from 1968 is the story about a serial killer most likely based on William Hirons, who is also known as the Lipstick Killer, and Ed Gein, yet the film foregrounds cross-dressing as inherent to the murderer's technique, despite the fact that neither Hirons nor Gein ever cross-dressed. Deranged from 1974 is a film about a farmer who cross-dresses using actual female body parts. Dress to Kill from 1980 features a cross-dressing serial killer with dissociative identity disorder. Sleepaway Camp from 1983 tells the story of a young transgender woman who goes on a murderous rampage at summer camp. And Hide and Go Shriek features an explicitly gay cross-dressing man who stalks and kills a group of heterosexual teen couples. And I have one more example I wanted to include, not necessarily because it has a cross-dressing killer, but just because it's kind of wild. So this one's Basic Instinct from 1992, and this one is a slight diversion from the trope, but I'm going to count it because it features a psychotic bisexual woman as the killer and leans on harmful stereotypes of bisexual women, conflating it with mental illness and suggesting that bisexual women exist either for the male gaze or to dupe straight women. And despite the clear portrayal of bisexuality, the word bisexual is never explicitly mentioned. So overall, it's just kind of a hot mess. And of course, there are so many more examples, but there's only so much time I have to edit this video. Just know that the portrayal of queer folks as inherent psychopaths and deranged killer has been spread way too far for way too long. However, there is one more example I have for this trope, but this is where things start to get complicated, because he's kinda done well.
You've seen all kinds of movies, but you've never seen anything like the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
I'm just a sweet transvestite. from transsexual Transylvania.
So here's where things get complicated, because Rocky Horror came out after the Hays Code era, and the film's queer-coded villain, Frankenfurter, is actually framed as sympathetic at times. However, the Rocky Horror Picture Show walks a fine line between embracing queer identity and exploiting it, and Frankenfurter's character still falls into the cross-dressing killer stereotype after all. The Rocky Horror Picture Show is a sci-fi horror film that follows the main couple Brad and Janet, just a pair of wholesome, all-American, mid-century stereotypes of innocent newlyweds. That is, until they get a flat tire in a spooky forest and have no choice but to ask for help at the nearest spooky, foreboding castle. Upon entering, it turns out that the castle happens to be home to a group of sexually liberated, gender-fluid aliens, but, you know. From here, the film quickly devolves into a wonderful sci-fi horror mashup that simultaneously delves into deep social and psychological issues like questioning your sexuality, questioning your gender, and pushing the boundaries of what can be expected from a heterosexual, monogamous relationship. While Brad and Janet serve as the protagonists, it could be argued that the main character of the film is Frankenfurter, the embodiment of the queer-coded villain. However, it's Frank's all-encompassing embracement of his queerness that makes things complicated, because he's actually very charming. That's not to say he's not a deeply flawed individual by any means. In fact, Frank is actually a cruel, selfish, abusive, violent rapist and murderer. Not only this, but again, we see that Frank is physically other. It wasn't enough just to make him not human, he's literally from outer space. But again, Frankenfurter is framed not only as an antagonist to the heteronormative Brad and Janet, but also as a sympathetic main character. Throughout the course of the film, Frankenfurter helps shift Brad and Janet away from their traditional views of sex, albeit a little bit through rape, but I digress, and opens them up to the possibility that sex can be also for pleasure, a novel concept rarely depicted in film in the early 1970s. And in the end, when we see Frank betrayed by one of his own and on the verge of death, we feel genuinely bad for him. Even Brad and Janet shed a few tears. This isn't to say that he isn't without fault, but Frankenfurter isn't necessarily bad representation. In fact, he plays a key role in Brad and Janet's self-actualization, in which Brad ends up questioning his traditional male gender roles and finds himself instead embracing his capacity of attraction to men and affinity for cross-dressing. Similarly, Frank directly helps Janet push the boundaries of the traditional role of docile housewife and embrace a more sexually liberated persona who takes ownership over and embraces her body. Now, discussing self-exploration and playing with gender expression was a huge deal for 1975, but perhaps because the Hays Code was no longer looming over the creative process, and the creator of the musical, Richard O'Brien, self-identifies as third gender, that could explain why the representation is more nuanced and this film comes across so earnestly. Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, Frankenfurter's cross-dressing, gender-bending queerness is not the origin of his crimes. He just happens to be a villain who's queer. He's not a villain because he's queer. This is what makes him stand out from the other examples. Animation affords filmmakers something unique, because almost anything is possible in illustrated character and costume design. However, even in animation, villains continue to fall into the queer-coded villain trope, regardless. So let's pivot a bit and look at Disney. Because Disney has been around since the early 1920s, they're plenty familiar with the Hays Code, and their villains certainly show it. Whew, it's hard not to pick up on a pattern here. Well, some of these might be a little more intentional than you might think, as evidenced by Ursula from The Little Mermaid. According to the academic article by Adelia Brown of Mount Holyoke College and published in the Maxey Journal from Johns Hopkins University, Ursula from The Little Mermaid, for example, was actually purposefully based on and modeled after a famous drag queen, Divine. Co-director John Musker, who helped to design Ursula, explicitly stated that he really tried to get some of Divine's big, campy, overweight diva across in the character. Her movement also resembles Divine's, as she shakes her hips and sashays through purple mood lighting reminiscent of a drag show.
And don't underestimate the importance of body language. Ha!
My life. Take whatever you like.
Yes.
How's this for a center spread?
Just from the short clip alone, the parallels between how she moves and uses exaggerated body language is very clear. But there are also parallels in her speech as well. Her speech resembles that of a drag persona.
They weren't kidding when they called me, well, a witch.
Therefore, we can start to see how queer-coding Ursula serves to associate her villainy with her drag persona. Brown further states, showing Ursula, a masculine character, don a more feminine appearance for the purpose of evil, connects cross-dressing and drag with evil intentions. She laughs maniacally as she transforms, emphasizing the villainy of dressing up as a feminine woman. Even the name Vanessa, given to Ursula's more conventionally feminine appearance, is derived from the Latin word vanitas, meaning vanity, which could further associate drag queens with shallow, power-hungry divas intent on tearing down other attractive women. Brown also comments on how Ursula breaks up heterosexual couples. Her example victims in Poor Unfortunate Souls include a conventional heterosexual couple that she corrupts. This reflects the way she tries to separate Ariel and Prince Eric. Ursula consistently fights against the positive ideal of heterosexual romance. And when her disguise dissolves at the wedding, she turns back into her masculine self. A bigger masculine character emerging from a feminine dress resembles a negative perception of drag queens, and the dark lighting and horrified reactions portray the behavior as evil. The wedding in particular also emphasizes Ursula's corruption of the heterosexual union. Ursula does not simply fight against the heroes, she fights against their heterosexual family structures. This positions her queerness as inherent to and part of her villainy. As if this formal character analysis doesn't already demonstrate how queer-coding Ursula equates drag with villainy, Ursula is again depicted as physically other, and she's a literal sea witch. So you might be asking yourself, what's the point of all of this? Well, this isn't to say that these characters aren't interesting or charming, and in fact, some of them are far more memorable and well-written than their generic and conventional heroic counterparts. The key issue here is fair representation. Because when the only characters queer kids or even adults have to look up to are the villains, it begins to feel pretty personal. While some of the examples presented can definitely be interpreted as slightly positive, the effect of seeing parts of yourself associated with evil or immorality time and time again is damaging and invalidating, especially when queer traits and influences are belittled and dehumanized to be objects of violence and evil. Furthermore, these stereotypes often pull from very superficial physical or personality traits that often perpetuate the idea that queerness can be easily defined based on looks or mannerisms, when in reality, queerness exists on a complex spectrum that's unique to every individual. Real people don't really fit into tropes or stereotypes. Unfortunately, queerness and villainy go together so well because the idea of being an other or outsider, i.e. not fitting in or being exiled, is an allegory that many queer people can sympathize with. Back in 2017, The Babadook became a queer icon after the film was mistakenly put into the LGBT section on Netflix, and people started to realize they could actually kind of sympathize with the way the Babadook is shunned or exiled and forced to hide in a basement, but continues to loom over the protagonist as a shadow of grief. In this way, well-written queer-coded antagonists can feel validating to certain experiences of being othered or shunned that queer people might feel in their real life. This just becomes an issue when villainhood is the only representation you have for yourself in media. It's unfair to queer people that their complex culture and identity is countlessly used to signify one-dimensional evil characters. As evidenced by Disney, queer-coding villains shows up in a lot of kids' movies and TV shows, which can affect their development as they grow up, learning what's good or bad, right or wrong, and they are taught to understand what being queer is based on what's being shown to them in media. So by now, you're probably like, okay, I get it. What can we do to make things better? And after going through these examples, it might make logical sense that the solution to this issue is simply erasing these characters' queer traits in possible reboots, or else ceasing to queer-code villains in the future altogether. However, erasing homosexuality or queer tendency can be just as harmful as a poorly written queer-coded villain in the first place. For example, in the remake of The Lion King, we see that erasing the homosexual undertones in Scar's character subsequently erased his personality and the character's vibrant essence. I mean, look at this side-by-side comparison. The remake is pretty boring. And Ursula, for example, is going to be played by Melissa McCarthy in the live-action remake. I mean, that just feels like a whole new character at that point. Therefore, the solution isn't to erase these characters, but to instead provide more queer representation in the other archetypes and tropes to offset their effect. Seeing more queer heroes or more heteronormative villains, in addition to these queer villains, makes it harder to associate specific traits with either good or evil, morality or immorality, which is more inclusive to all audiences. That's not to say that some positive examples of queer representation don't already exist, because films like Brokeback Mountain, But I'm a Cheerleader, and nearly the entire filmography of John Waters provide characters and narratives that rework genre conventions to show that well-loved film conventions are also capable of loving and telling positive queer narratives. There's also a way to write queer villains well, and create interesting round characters that are multifaceted and can be simultaneously shown to be heroic in their own ways. Elsa from Frozen, for example, displays queer-coded traits, and she functions as both an antagonist and a sympathetic main character. Adelia Brown includes another critic's acknowledgement of parallels between the kingdom's rejection of the magical powers and society's rejection of homosexuality. This positions Elsa as a gay person living in a homophobic society. Indeed, the emphasis of closing doors in an attempt to keep her powers hidden away from everyone liken Elsa's hidden powers to the metaphor of homosexuality being quote-unquote in the closet. The juxtaposition between Anna and Elsa during The First Time in Forever contrasts Anna's heterosexuality to Elsa's ice powers, comparing Elsa's ice powers to homosexuality. Let It Go also contributes to this reading, as according to another critic, many equate it with the experience of coming out and accepting one's sexual orientation. Elsa, quote-unquote, lets go of her restraint because now they know, mirroring the way a gay person stops restraining themselves once others already know they are gay. Thus, we can come to understand Elsa as queer-coded, but in a more complicated dynamic than simply quote-unquote villain. She's first introduced to us as a daughter, then a sister, and then a main character. Brown elaborates on her character analysis that, like Ursula, Elsa serves as an obstacle to Anna's heterosexual romance. This ties her behavior into queerness, and it initially seems villainous. However, because Hans ends up taking the role of the villain, thwarting his romance with Anna, actually positions Elsa's queerness as heroic. In fact, Ron Clements, the co-director of The Little Mermaid, points out the connection between early Ursula sketches and early Elsa sketches, which emphasizes the similar brands of queer coding in their original character designs. This visible evolution in the sketches is interesting because it shows that the filmmakers purposefully chose to go a more human and conventionally attractive route, which separates Elsa from the other examples in Disney of queer-coding villains. Elsa is not physically other. She's still a conventionally attractive human woman that little kids can associate with any other Disney princess. In fact, I've seen so many little kids dress as Elsa for Halloween, or even just go to the grocery store on a random Tuesday. She's pretty, she's strong, she's brave, and she's someone worth looking up to. I mean, she's a queen, for God's sake. And yet, she's still queer-coded. That is positive representation. In a way, there's something sort of empowering about seeing yourself as an all-powerful villain on the big screen. And the ironic thing about queer-coding villains is, even the queerest of villains are still presented as serious and cool in a way. So it's not like these characters are going to actually frighten anyone away from their queer identity. And in all honesty, even some straight audiences might find themselves wanting to emulate the villain's badass behaviors or mannerisms. Frankenfurter did turn even the straightest of couples into queer adjacent, so I mean... But let's circle back to the tweet that started this whole journey, and look at one of the replies. Don't be gay, you get a cooler costume, a show-stopping musical number, and a cool lair. Wait, get back here. Because I mean, really, who wouldn't want the more elaborate, interesting costume?